If you're looking to be the best, let me get this off my chest. You should look no further than this Rebellion fervor. If you want that sort of traction, join the Rebel faction.
It only matters if it ladders. Comment below as we walk through Week 10 of Foundation Standard. Alrighty folks, this week we had a whopping 20 major tournaments to analyze, totaling 160 top 8 spots. RCQs across the world. They were firing all the way from war-torn Ukraine to the Philippines and back. Coming in first, finalizing their ascent to the top, is Esper Pixie with 5 trophies and 24 top 8 spots. 25% of all possible trophies were taken by Esper Pixie, despite taking only 15% of those top 8 spots, which tells you that this deck converts when it hits the top tables, and that is a big deal.
Coming in second is Dimir Bounce. 20 top 8s, 3 trophies of its own. The unofficial little brother to Esper Pixies, really. This deck packs a serious punch and grinds just a bit harder, though lacks some of the same explosive starts.
Third place goes to yet another Dimir deck, this time Ye Old Faithful, known as Dimir Tempo. 22 top 8s and 2 trophies later, we have the makings of an archetype that Wizards frankly may need to consider bans for moving forward. If the top 3 decks are all using roughly the same cards with minor engine tweaks, that's not a great sign for Standard, frankly.
Yeah, really. Gruul Aggro, though, rounds out our Tier 1 options with a solid 19 top 8s and 3 trophies. The builds continue to shift flex slots routinely as players try different options to combat the wave of Pixie and Dimir decks, not to mention the rest.
Kicking off Tier 2, we've got Domain once more, though this time it snagged 2 trophies out of 13 top 8 spots. A strong improvement for the archetype as it struggled to find its footing in a format this fast-paced in the past.
Oh yeah, and Omni Combo continues its ascension of the tier rankings, coming in 6th with 5 top 8s and 2 trophies of its own. The evolution of the archetype has only improved over these past few weeks, and it's really proving to be a contender now.
Golgari Midrange once again made the list with 12 top 8s despite a complete lack of hardware yet again. This archetype has begun to feel like a trap, playing just well enough to get the top 8 and then getting eaten alive by everybody once it gets there.
Absolutely. And lastly, in 8th place, we have the return of Azorius Oculus, boasting 9 top 8s, no trophies though. With a couple of graveyard-centric decks in Tier 2 land, we have to wonder how long it will be before Ghost Vacuum and friends are back in sideboards.
Yeah, that's true. Over in Brewer's Corner, I'll be featuring Orzhov Life and Golgari Control. Orzhov pulled off an RCQ win of its own, showcasing the Brew's strength in a field of Pixie.
I'll be highlighting Mono Black Demons and Azorius Enchantress updates, each with top 8s at major tournaments this past weekend. So let's kick off our archetype breakdowns, first with Esper Pixie.
Misplaced Ginger was back at it again, smashing through a 76-player MTGO challenge this past Sunday with the Esper Pixie update. And let's take a look here. Now, we've got a solidified threat base at this point, Max. We've got 14 creatures, and those 2 Mockingbirds only improve the more you're going to see this mirror match. The more you get to say, oh, you've got a Pixie, I've got an extra Pixie. It's really strong when you get to those mirror matches. Now, flex slots, you've got the Defiled Crypt, 1 Sheltered by Ghosts, and a couple of Go for the Throats. I like that we're on Go for the Throat, and we've stopped trying to pile drive like 4 Sheltered by Ghosts into these decks. We've started to realize that you just have to kill some things to maintain your tempo advantage. You don't have to get a full tempo ramp up with Sheltered by Ghosts every time. But there's still a copy in the main, and there's a couple copies of Sheltered by Ghosts sitting in the sideboard. So I like where this build has tried to balance some of the weaknesses of the past. There's also 3 Rest in Peace in the sideboard, which is an acknowledgement in the rise of the Oculus and Omniscience decks, which also a strong move.
Right, we're really starting to see sort of an inbred meta, I'd like to say, especially with Mockingbirds. I think that's a sign that we are across these different decks. But Sheltered by Ghosts making a return, is it finally safe to embrace this card for the current, removal-friendly meta?
I'll be honest, of all the cards sitting in Misplaced Ginger's list, this is the only one I flat disagree with. The ward doesn't matter as much when you're playing Nowhere to Runs back and forth, right? It struggles there. Lithomantic Barrage is something that every red player should have at least 3 copies of sitting in their sideboard at this point, and that also ignores all the pieces of Sheltered by Ghosts. So I don't like it. I get why it's there. I understand the tempo swing, and if they don't have the answer, it sure does take over the game. But if they have the answer, you're getting 2 for 1, and it's not a good look. So I don't know. I think it's a very high-risk card to be having right now. Whereas, looking at that list, they had Break the Spell. And that is some hot mirror attack, Max. That 1 mana blow up an enchantment or a token, that is the hottest mirror attack I've seen for Esper Pixie in a while, and seeing 3 copies in the sideboard, I like where they're going there. The Sheltered by Ghosts, not so much.
All right, yeah. Yeah, that's exactly the feeling I get when I see the card. I have nightmares of running that card myself in, several white-based decks and just getting blown out by anything red-based. So yeah, I'm in full agreement with you. I think the card's a high-risk maneuver, even if you're just thinking tempo. But speaking of tempo, let's talk about another bounce deck. I said it's an inbred meta. Here's Dimir Bounce.
So just this past Monday, Pedro Stone took down a 90-player MTGO challenge with Dimir Bounce, proving that this town truly ain't big enough for the rest of the goddamn format. Now, let's dive into what we're doing here. The 3-3 split of Curiosity and Kaido is the engines at the top. That's really where the crux of this deck lies, is that it has Enduring Curiosity at the top end, so it grinds a little bit harder when you're trying to just push for straight-up card advantage, right? The 2 Witch's Vanity you see in the sideboard here, you're also seeing those Esper Pixie sideboards. That's a pushback against the aggro decks in the format, and it's a strong one when you get to bounce it back and forth with Fear of Isolations, and this town ain't big enough. Just more reusable removal to go with nowhere to run. Now, this build, I think, has a weaker Gruul matchup main board. So you see, Gix's Command, Preacher, Shelly. You see a lot in the sideboard to try to address that. And that's probably a strong move right now because Gruul is absolutely trying to hunt its way through Dimir Bounce, Dimir Tempo, and Esper Pixie. Not saying it's been very successful, but it sure has been trying lately. And that's what it has to do at this point.
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing that's kind of outside the radar of Tier 1 right now is, decks like Domain, decks like Selesnya. I know we love to pull Hopeless Nightmare post-board for decks such as Domain, anything green-based, because of the rise in Bay loss in sideboards. But in case of pulling out Hopeless Nightmare, what are the best options for cards to bring in against those matchups?
I mean, against a deck like that, you turn more into a traditional Dimir Tempo build, right? And that's also part of the advantage this has over Esper Pixies, is that you can just shift your role. And you can say, no, now we're just Dimir Tempo. We're playing Tidebinders, Negates, Duresses. Like, we're going to just be disruptive. We're going to counter stuff. And we're going to continue to maintain that tempo advantage against a deck that doesn't really know how to respond to you playing stuff on their end step and never has. But I don't know that Hopeless Nightmare is going to come out, frankly, because there's just not enough room to cut all the things you want to cut. And you don't want cut downs, right? You don't want nowhere to runs. Those are just dead cards. That's already 6 slots that you have to come off the sideboard for. So maybe it's just high risk, high reward, where you say, I have Hopeless Nightmare, and we're just going to bet you don't have that many Baloths and you don't have one in your opening hand. Like, maybe that is where they're at this point. I don't love that, but I can respect that they're just going high risk if they feel like they're behind.
I think I agree with you, and I think mostly because I'm seeing when people are bringing the Baloths into their sideboard, it's usually just 2 copies. For some reason, players only want to devote 2 slots to that strategy, and I can understand why, but I think the response from those decks is just to devote more slots to Baloth, right? Like at least 3. But players aren't being that secure about that matchup, so yeah, I agree with you. You just take the risk with Hopeless Nightmare, for sure. Speaking about tempo, let's talk about Dimir Tempo.
So Maeda Yusuke managed to snag some hardware at the 33-player Champions Cup qualifier in Japan this past Friday with Dimir Tempo, and let's look at this build. Max, to me, this looks like a throwback to the Spotlight Atlanta build. You've got that 2 Faebloom trick in the main, you've got the 3 Spell Stutters, where it's a much more balanced build, except you see those 4 Soulstone Sanctuaries sitting there, which is a little wild to see all 4 copies sitting down there. But you go to the sideboard, you have some more balance there as well. You've got the Ghost Vacuums, you've got 4 counter spells, a couple of Tishanas, you've got Neutralize the Guards for the Mirror, you've got Shellys for aggro, you've got the End, which also seems really spicy when you're going up against Kaidos and Enduring Curiosities to just rip out their engine. So to me, this is a very balanced build. In a way, this is kind of what Golgari has been trying to do and failing to do for a long time, which is saying, okay, we're not going to be the most explosive deck. We're going to grind, and we're going to grind successfully with all the bounce decks. And perhaps because this is in blue, this has the ability to grind a little bit harder than pushing into green.
Yeah, and with the removal suite in this deck, this deck wants to be a tempo deck. Considering that we're still seeing some aggro play, what is the correct balance? What's the nuance here between selecting Nowhere to Run or Anoint with Affliction?
So in the Tempo deck, I would prefer to go into Anoint with Affliction because I think the Exile is far more critical for what we're doing in general, and I don't know that the Ward matters as much in a format that has so many other decks that are ignoring it and forcing people to play around that, right? So like if everybody's running Ward cards, Nowhere to Run looks great, but now that all the top decks, all the bounce decks are running Nowhere to Run, you don't need one as badly because people shouldn't be running cards that are reliant on ward as much. Now people are going to rely on cards like Oculus that doesn't care about Nowhere to Run, and Anoint with Affliction's much better there. Similarly speaking, you see Gruul builds that are trying to outscale Nowhere to Run, but you can't outscale Anoint with Affliction. So it's kind of 6 to 1, half a dozen to the other, and you're just trying to make a meta call depending on where you think the meta is locally for you. But I don't know that there's a wrong answer so much as there's a wrong answer for your local meta, and you should know which way you have to, shift that.
Yeah, there's no way to get around paying attention, analyzing your local metas, and again, that's our calling card. We're going to say that week after week as a response to one of the questions is pay attention to your local metas. Definitely meta-dependent question here. Speaking of which, meta-dependent questions, right? Which red-based aggro are you going to be facing? Let's talk a little bit about Gruul Aggro.
I apologize if I butcher this name. Obara Yuichiro smashed through a 29-player Rumble in Yokohama, Japan this past Sunday with Gruul Aggro, and let's look at this spice. So, first thing I really want everyone to pay close attention to, Case of the Crimson Pulse. I know people look at this and they wonder why. Okay, Urbrask's Forge, it's dead in this format. I just want you guys to accept that. I don't know why it's sitting in the sideboard. It's dead. Bounce decks, just going to bounce it back. Golgari, just going to kill it with Terra Sunders, Tranquil Throwbacks, or reset it with Gliss if they're dumb enough to run Gliss in a Nowhere to Run format, right? You get to Domain, Mono White, they play Authority of the Consoles. They don't care. They're going to get right around it. So I don't think you play Forge, but Case of the Crimson Pulse is amazing right now. This card lets you grind against the Esper decks. It lets you enact a game plan where you just dump their hand into their removal and you come out ahead instead of coming out, -2 cards and they have the board presence. Because they just have to answer everything on impact, and then you land a case and start ancestraling every turn. And if they want to bounce it, you don't care because it literally reads discard a card, then draw 2 every time you replay it. So you don't mind them bouncing it at all. You just keep developing and keep shoving threats down their throat. It's been critical for me when I've been playing this Gruul matchup versus Esper Pixie to have cases and questing druids that we have longevity in that matchup, because otherwise we just lose to card advantage.
I think that's the future, especially for Gruul Aggro, which is a deck that's been hanging on to its tier 1 spot for a long time now, is to find ways to play around that bounce. And as you pointed out, for the longevity, I think the Questing Druid, I think in Case of the Crimson Pulse is a nice development for the deck. So my question for you, Obliterating Bolt in the main, Scorching Shot in the sideboard, we're seeing those cards in there as well. Can you explain sort of the nuances of this choice? I know another card that usually gets tossed in there is, Witchstalker's Frenzy. Why no Witchstalker's Frenzy? Why these cards?
So I like Scorching Shot in this build in particular because there's no Soulstone Sanctuary. I don't think you can afford to run Scorching Shots typically when you see Soulstones, because that plus Rockface Village means that you're not necessarily hitting that on even 3 mana in your deck, which is a problem because at 3 mana you absolutely need to be able to cast Scorching Shot, and often you want to be able to cast it at 2, right? So I think Scorching Shot is a more stable choice than Witchstalker Frenzy. Witchstalker Frenzy has a higher ceiling and it has a much lower basement. And we've had that, conversation back and forth in the, guild mages trying to decide which way we were going to go for Atlanta. We landed on Scorching Shot for stability, which I think it did a great job for us. It got a lot of us into day 2, right? Obliterating Bolts is an acknowledgement that we're at a format where Enduring Curiosity has to be killed on impact and it has to actually be gone at the end of it. So I think that's part of why we see Obliterating Bolt shifting over to the main, is just saying, okay, what's dead must not rise again. We cannot have this, it kind of dies, but then everything draws you cards when it attacks us, because then you lose that card advantage war that Case normally lets you win. So I think that's where they're going with this. I don't know that it's correct, but it's interesting, and it's worth examining.
Absolutely. Thank you for that analysis. I think that's one of those things that doesn't get discussed enough, is sort of, what's the difference between these different bits of removal, whether it's Nowhere to Run versus Anoint with Affliction, or, Scorching Shot versus Witchstalker's Frenzy. There is a nuance here. And I think it's very important to pay attention to when you're doing your deck building, especially for local metas. Again, but that does it for tier one's archetypes. Let's go ahead and drop down into tier two, where I'm going to start with an exciting build of Zur's Domain.
Oh yeah, Zur Domain.
This deck has been around the block for quite a while now. It's gone through different iterations, and I've said some hot takes about this deck. I've gotten some flack in the comments for how I've wanted to build this deck, but finally, Red Splash Vindication, Overlord of the Builder Bilges, 3 copies of in the main. Somebody followed my advice. Ferris and Eric won the 50-player RCQ in Milan this past Sunday with this version of Zur's Overlord and friends. Look, I think Overlord of the Boiler Bridge is a great pick, especially when you're playing with Zur. Being able to over and over again do that damage is devastating. Devastating to the opponent's creatures, planeswalkers, face. You have great many targets to hit with. This is a great card. I'm going to advocate for this over the Blue Overlord almost every time. We're also seeing 2 copies of Pyroclasm in the sideboard. We were talking about hedging between lower board wipes. This is considered what's been known as Magic as a baby wipe. It doesn't kill everything, it just kills your low end stuff. And I think there's enough aggro and token decks in the meta to warrant having Pyroclasm in here. Also seeing the split between Day of Judgment and Sunfall, love that as well. I think the way this deck splashes into the other colors, so that you're getting a little bit of what you need from these other colors, but you're not relying heavily on it. I think that's a good strategy. You have access to Zur, you have access to the Red Overlord, to your ley lines, Pyroclasm, Negate, and we even see that 1 copy of Doppelgang in the sideboard. So I like the way this deck is built. I think it's a pretty good starting place if you're talking about just picking up Domain and starting to tune it.
Fair. Now, I look at this build, Max, and have we finally found a build of Domain that can compete consistently in a fast-paced format? Is that what this is to you?
It feels a little bit that way. I do lament a few little choices here and there. There's maybe some tension that's unresolved in the way I build this deck. Only 2 copies of the White Overlord. That's kind of, that makes me hesitate a little bit. Only 2 copies of Herd Migration. I love the mana fixing and the life gain you get from that card. I always advocate for at least 3 or 4 copies. But this is more balanced than even my feelings really warrant for those cards to be 3-ofs. It seems closer to what I personally envision Domain needing to be to follow in this kind of format. Honestly, and like I said, I think it's a really good starting spot. I might find a way to slide in that 3rd Herd Migration, but personally, I'm honestly going to pick up this version of the deck and just start piloting it and tuning from there. I think there's some pieces in here that need to stick, like the 2 copies of Analyze the Pollen. I think that's a great early game, great late game card. It scales really well. Even you have said before that the mana base tends to be what kills this deck, what makes it trip over itself. You get beaten by your own mana base a lot of the time, so you need that fixing in the early game. And just as a side note, I think Pyroclasm is just a really great choice, honestly, for the format right now. It's hitting your aggro matchups, it's hitting your token matchups. So I want to see more Pyroclasms in red-based sideboards everywhere.
That's fair, and I'm with you. Like, the mana base has been historically what crushes Domain, but at least if we're going to be greedy, we're going into red finally and saying there's going to be a payoff to this greed that isn't something you can trample through. It's going to be removal. It's going to actually deal with some of the systemic issues we've seen with Domain answering those early Gruul threats, right? Like Boiler Bilges, Pyroclasm, they do that. So I'm with you. I like this build. I think it's spicy. But speaking of spicy builds, let's look at Omni Combo.
Oh man, we keep seeing this show up in tier 2, and that's wild. That goes totally against the prediction I had in the first few weeks, where I thought this was kind of a flash in the pan deck. And I think Nate Fursa made a further argument, taking down a 33-player RCQ in Wisconsin this past Saturday with this deck. Really putting the whole world on notice. This deck's not a flash in the pan. Main board, you're seeing very few shifts. You're only seeing shifts to solidify consistency. They did add a second Blast Zone. I think Blast Zone is one of those overlooked cards that helps in a heavy token, heavy aggro meta. The sideboard, you're going to see some shifts. I think the sideboard is mainly where you're going to see shifts, of course, because the sideboard is turning into a wish board. We've got Heroic Reinforcements, for example, in here to give things haste, give you that possibility of killing your opponent upon getting the Omniscience into play. Breach the Multiverse is also in here as well, and I think that card is well positioned considering what we're facing with the Go Big decks. We do have 3 copies of Temporary Lockdown. Needing to stutter step aggro, I think that's just a necessity, and this card kind of helps with that. It is super risky against Pixie, right, because they can bounce it and get some of their stuff back. But I think that card is there partially to answer cards like Rest in Peace, which is the typical graveyard hate card that white base decks are using. So it does kind of help resolve, getting the Omniscience in off of the graveyard for that. So I don't know. These adjustments, I like seeing these adjustments. I want to challenge players to, go even further with the Wish board on the Omni Combo.
Well, that gets into the question of this. Like, should the sideboard be mostly a wish board with a few cards like Grand Abolisher to present that additional layer of protection post board?
Oh yeah. I like Grand Abolisher, by the way. I think it challenges players who are using the typical flash speed answers to try to combat this deck. Aside from the lockdowns, I feel like the sky's really the limit when you have a wish board possibility going on here, and I think I want to see more spicy cards. I think there's some spicier cards that we could advocate for here. Omni players go wild. There's a combo deck in Standard right now, and it's viable. Get after it. Combo players hardly ever get an actual meta deck to go after and build, and I think Omni Combo is presenting sort of a window of opportunity. Since we're not really seeing your traditional counterspell type of control decks out there right now, combo should be a thing. So Omni players, get after it.
I also love that Blast Zone can take out Rest in Pieces. Like, that's such spice that you just have the ability to go, all right, you landed the way to deal with me, but on your end step, blow that shit up, and then we get going. So, no, I'm with you. It's a spicy deck. It's got a lot of layers to it. It's way more frustrating to play on Arena than Paper, since in Paper you just show the loop and move on to the next game. But, sometimes on Arena you just got to get Carpal Tunnel to win, and that's worth it for many people. So, here's a deck that's not going to give you Carpal Tunnel, although it may give you a headache. Golgari Midrange.
Good old Golgari Midrange, right? It has staying power, but just doesn't seem to have much else. And Apple Chips did make it to the top 8 of Monday's 90-player MTGO challenge with this deck. What did they get right? Where did they go wrong? We've got you covered either way. First thing we're going to point out here, full set of Sentinels, full set of Creatures of the Schism. Right? The key here, not wanting to lose any of your 3 drops and nowhere to run. You used to see 3-4 copies of Glissa in this spot, and that's been taken out for this very reason. And I think that's a good choice. I think relying more on the Preacher for your card advantage is probably a good choice here. The 4 toughness is hard to deal with. 2 copies of Thrun, because Esper Pixie, Dimir Bounce, they need a Tithing Blade to kill this card. They need to make you sacrifice it. Otherwise, it's just going to run right through. And it's a great way, honestly, to keep Kaido off the board, keep him from attacking, while also presenting a really thick clock. So, big shout out to Thrun. Always love this card when I see it. 2 copies of Baloth also in the sideboard for your Bounce Pixie decks. That's a nice Hopeless Nightmare there, bro. Here's a Baloth.
So, I mean, Max, we look at this archetype, and it keeps top-8ing, it keeps making waves, and it keeps failing to get hardware. What is holding this archetype back from finally getting a trophy?
I'm finally going to go out on a limb and just say that this deck lacks a coherent game plan. The peak of this deck was when it did have one. It held its ground around Demons and ANX. It had a consistent curve. It knew what it wanted to do, turns 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now the deck seems to have gone back to just classic mid-range tactics, wanting to grind you down and win the grind fest. And while it does win grind fest generally, it really lacks a coherent game plan. And that means that this really just loses to anything that gets that, what we call the proverbial nut draw, right? It loses to that nut draw. It relies on the opponent's missteps, missing land drops. It doesn't really hate out any particular deck. And this has really become the go-to deck, I want to say, for anyone who doesn't know exactly what they want to bring to the event or the RCQ. And it does perform numbers, but it doesn't do much else. I really want to challenge Golgari Brewers this week. Think about another strategy. Think about a way through, because honestly, the Golgari color set has access to some of the best cards, the best planeswalkers, the best creatures, the best removal, the best responses. There really has to be a path forward somewhere, and it's just a shame to see Golgari go to the wayside and not get any trophies week after week. We keep saying it. So I want to challenge y'all to actually think about how, consciously how you build Golgari, because, just throwing a bunch of mid-range cards in there doesn't seem to really be working.
Yeah, the game plan of I'm going to play the best cards on curve in these colors is not the same as saying we have the best engines. It's basically saying these are great individual cards, and I hope that each of them present enough of an issue that they'll get there on their own. And it's just not realistic from what I'm seeing. You need to have more synergy, frankly. You can't just play Golgari good stuff and win tournaments. But I'm with you, Max. Let's look at the very last deck in Tier 2. Azorius Oculus.
Azorius Oculus is back, and Bactuccinia made it to the finals of Saturday's 32-player MTGO Challenge before falling to, guess what, Esper Pixies. But Oculus continues to search for a path through the Foundation's meta, and here's the latest iteration. I'm just going to say this iteration relies on the speed of Founding of the Third Path. This card continues to be a mainstay, and I think it's a choice between this card and Draycatcher to stabilize, Ledger Shredder style, if you think back to that card. We do see copy of Undercity Sewers. It does seem a little greedy on the mana base, to be honest. Blocking out your turn one. I can see why players would do this though, because we're seeing this version have a heavy reliance on the 2 mana value spot. And anytime you see that situation, players will tend to build towards it being okay to have that Surveil land turn one. So I can kind of see why 3 copies of Temporary Lockdown is a little bit risky post board when you think about the Pixie and the bounce decks out there. But I can also see how that's a given in a lot of these builds, because you're not, there's no tension, there's no 2 mana value creatures that you're worried about, bouncing. So I can see why that is. And I'm just going to really be frank here and reiterate that, our prior week's analysis, Draycatcher, I think that build is a little bit stronger for a few different reasons. But we can get into that in the comments if you like.
Fair. And I'm sure this will load up the comment section, but, do you think that this deck needs to be embracing this, turbo graveyard fill approach, or do you think it needs a more balanced approach with Draycatcher, which we've said often is kind of like a Ledger Shredder for Standard when you get to Oculus, at least?
Yeah, I think you and I both know the answer to that. As the weeks advance, especially, graveyard play is going to become less and less safe. I know up till now, you haven't seen enough graveyard hate in sideboards, but that's changing. Players have begun to catch on to graveyard-based decks like Omni Combo, for example, and some of that side hate is going to go towards Oculus, especially if you're heavily reliant on the graveyard. So I just feel like Draycatcher with some good 1 mana value spells is a bit of a safer bet. Sometimes you can win on Draycatcher alone. You don't even need Oculus to come in, and when it doesn't, and you have the Draycatcher out there and you win anyway, it feels really good. So I try the Draycatcher build if you haven't yet. If you're playing Oculus, just try it. Just try it for a week on Arena Ladder and see how it feels. I promise you there's something there.
Yeah, we had a lot of fun with it. It also led to us realizing mono white control wasn't viable for GP Atlanta, because we were sitting there going, Draycatcher is a problem card. So, That said, we're going to move on from the tier list. We're going to get to my favorite segment of the show every week, Brewer's Corner. Let's kick things off, Max, and tell us all about Mono Black Demons.
All right. I still love the Demons builds. It might be a pet card for me, Annex, but I still love the Demons builds, and I really think that this is the best shelf for Demons build and Annex. There's really no problems with the mana base. You can go all in on the 2 Black Devotion cards. You have plenty of early game disruption with duress, removal. You've also got must answer threats. And I think that's what Demons suffered from when it was under Golgari and Dimir, is it needed those must answer threats that the opponent can't just ignore. They have to interact with you. They can't build these combo decks, for example, that have no interaction. They have to interact with you. So I also want to point out just a little trick play here with Abyssal Harvester. If you're dealing with enduring creatures, whether it's Otters with the Enduring Vitality, whether it's Innocence or Courage with the Dimir builds, Curiosity, not Courage. Courage is the red one. You can destroy an enduring creature, regular style, then copy it with the Harvester before it comes back from the graveyard and becomes an enchantment. So it's a good way to deal with those cards. Also, the Bloodletter of Aclazotz really speeds up the clock, regardless of whether you have Annex on the board or it's your demon for Annex or not. This plus the Slasher make a great plan B, and I think that's what the Golgari Demons deck was missing, is not being able to rely on Slasher plus Aclazotz as a plan B. And just a quick side note, Soul Guide Lantern, I know everybody uses Rest in Peace, but if you're not in white colors, Soul Guide Lantern is a really great graveyard hate card, just because you can instant speed respond to your opponent trying to pull something from the graveyard.
Absolutely. It's a spicy list. It is. I'm not sure I agree with Lily of the Veil sitting in that main board right now, but outside of that, I like a lot of what I'm seeing in there. But we're going to move it along. We're going to talk about Orzhov Life. All right, apologies on the name again. Kimura Yuichi won a 22-player Champ Cup qualifier in Hiroshima, Japan. I love this list. this is the coolest version of this deck I've seen so far. We are all in on Raise the Past, and we're all in on Little Dirtles that scale. So like it's kind of fun in the sense that you get to start by just flooding the board with all of these cards that are kind of meh, like basically draft chaff that you're running around with, but they have to answer them before they start scaling things like Essence Channeler. You know, like you have to answer bats pretty quickly. You got to deal with Amalia before it scales. And even when you do, we might just grab them back with Case. And if we don't, we might just grab them back with Raise the Past. And I love that we're sitting here with a couple of split ups saying, it's okay. You can just, you know, get ahead of me, outscale me. I'll blow up your side of the board. Maybe mine too. Bring it all back. Who cares? Like it does so much work in just grinding if they do not have answers to the graveyard. Post board, I don't know how this deals with like Rest in Peace and some of the other cards. But, you know, if your opponent's not on Sunfalls and Rest in Pieces, this deck starts looking a lot better when they're just like, hey, we're going to, you know, try to outvalue you with nowhere to runs. And you're like, go for it. I'll just bring back the whole damn graveyard. So I like it. I think it's a spicy choice right now with all this bounce that's running around to have a really low curve and the ability to just bring it all back.
Yeah, there's something to be said right now in the meta for going low curve, and I think that's what this deck thrives on. It wants to get underneath the Beans decks, for example, and you know, it has that possibility, you know, by turn 4 to be doing its thing. So, yeah, very good list.
Alrighty, we're gonna move it along. Azorius Enchantress, let's do it.
Let's go. I'm excited to talk about Azorius Enchantress. Gary C. did win 21-player RCQ in Ireland with this list. I just want to say, this is one of those, you know, similar to Orzhov Life, this is one of those archetypes that was toyed with early in Foundations and, you know, kind of never really found its footing. I think, though, there's a time and a place for that right now, especially going low curve. Low curve seems to be the solution to a lot of these decks in the meta. 22 enchantments in this deck in particular. The new tech is Hall Creeper plus your Enduring Curiosity. You know, Hall Creeper by itself really didn't seem like enough when I played with it, but when you combine it with Enduring Curiosity, creates some really serious card advantage. Kaito is also a very overlooked you know, version of the card. Everybody's playing with Bane of Nightmares, but Cunning Infiltrator can get to that 9 loyalty, especially in a shell like this, relatively quickly. So, you know, beware the Kaito Cunning Infiltrator. I really think that we should be having, you know, putting more attention on this particular version of Kaito. The lone issue I think with this card is protecting him, but of course he does have that -2. Any Planeswalker that protects itself, especially at 3 mana value, is, you know, pretty high grade Planeswalker in my view, at least in the past. So, you know, I kind of want to try this deck out and see how it does, especially with that different Kaido.
I mean, if you get an Inquisitive Glimmer to stick on turn 2, you can get a turn 3 Enduring Curiosity. And that's kind of nuts when you get to go like turn 1 Optimistic Scavenger, turn 2 Glimmer, turn 3 Curiosity, swing. You know, like just, that is not an easy curve. I also love that it has the Mockingbird's max. So you, like, if you're playing against Pixie and they go Scavenger, you're like, oh no, we're both playing with Scavenger. We've got 7 copies of this card now. So it's spicy. I really do like a lot of the pieces that they went with. But we're going to move it along to the final brew, Golgari Ramp/Control. I never know exactly how to designate this one. Shout out to Hermes in the MTGR Discord for sending us this list. This has been, you know, their latest attempt to push through the RCQ format, and I believe they've done pretty well with it. So you've got your, you know, traditional kind of ramp engine here with Beans and Overlord, but a ton of removal on the front end, and this is trying to fix what Domain struggled with so much, which is just simplifying the mana base and saying the Beans engine's enough, we just need removal on top of it. Now what I like about it is that we've got the Maze Mind Tomes. We've got a really solid alternative draw engine sitting at 2 mana, so we don't have to see Beans right away to actually push through and grind. I also love that we're playing all these deadly cover-ups. The cranial extraction effect on this is something that cannot be understated. The ability to use this to get rid of enduring creatures is fantastic. The ability to use this to just reset the board for a deck that's going to have a lot of card advantage, also fantastic. So Urgent Necropsy, I think, also super spicy in this list. The ability to hit so many different targets against these Pixie lists in particular, where they might have an enchantment, a Kaido, a creature, and you're like, all 3 go. 3 for 1 right now. I love it. I love where they're trying to go with this.
Oh yeah, me too. Deadly Cover Up, I think, is an underutilized board wipe right now, and there's definitely room in the meta for it, for sure. So thank you, Hermes, for that list.
And that's going to bring us to our final segment, Ahead of the Curve. Now, Max, we looked at, again, 12 archetypes in our recap. What are you playing going into week 11 of Foundation Standard?
All right, so I'm going to be taking a look back at other demons lists, other alternatives besides Golgari, and we just talked about Mono Black. Let's talk about Rakdos demons. All right, so what advantage do we have in Rakdos? I was taking a look at, one of the problems with demons decks is finding a low curve alternative to, things like, Archfiend of the Dross, right? So we found a Shapeshifter, Tyrian Mauler, 4 copies of this card in this version of the deck. It does dodge cut down despite it being a 2/2 because, as the text says, whenever an opponent casts a spell, put a 1/1 counter on it. And this becomes a must-answer threat over time, especially when you're dealing with other low-curve decks that want to, nickel and dime you. Tyrian Mauler is well positioned in that meta. Full set of Preachers, 4 toughness is a great stat line, and Preachers becomes an alternative, card advantage engine on the top end. And I want to just make a brief argument. I think you can go 5 mana value, 6 mana value with this deck, at least one of, because one of the ways to ramp is to get your lane drops every turn. And if you're curving out all the way to 6, something like Rakdos, Patron of Chaos, looks pretty good. The ability to, make your opponent pay in the end game when everybody's run out of resources, you've won the resource war with ANX. Patron of Chaos really just puts the nail in the coffin. And Rakdos the Muscle is like a huge Immersturm Predator with a serious payoff, allowing you to play even more cards on top of what you already are drawing from Annex or Preacher. So this deck has the potential for major card advantage, and the removal suite's really good. You have access to red with Obliterating Bolt. And again, I'm going to make the argument for Pyroclasm here, 3 copies of it in the sideboard. So I think there are cards in here that make Rakdos well positioned, some must-answer threats. Let's see how it does this week against the myriad of Tier 1, Tier 2 archetypes.
I mean, I love that Tyrian Mauler says your next spell has to be Nowhere to Run, or Nowhere to Run is turned off for this creature. And that's fun to just force that immediately. Like, if they have to go bounce spell into Nowhere to Run, they better be bouncing the Mauler too, because otherwise it's now out of range. So that's spicy. I like where you're going with that. On my end, Selesnya Cage.
Ooh.
So Paw Patch Recruit is one hell of a card right now. All of the targeted removals running around. And Collector's Cage allows us to play this deck like it's almost a pseudo Sneak and Show vibe from Legacy. Like, I've gotten turn 3 Overlord of the Mistmoors, and I can tell you in this format, if you get that on turn 3, I have yet to lose. It's pretty damn good. Similarly, people don't realize this, but Cage can grab Virtue and let you cast the 5 mana side of it. So you get to these board states where with Cage, you have to have 3 creatures, right? So if you get Virtue off of that, you're basically saying, okay, I've got 3 creatures at different powers, and all of them are now scaling. And then everything else in my deck creates 1 to 2 more creatures. So you're just scaling. No mid-range deck can keep up with it once you get started. So I like where it's at there. It is soft to sweepers. Your love of Pyroclasm is something that scares the shit out of me with this deck, Max. But it's got Aven Interrupters in the sideboard, and that has helped mitigate some of the mono-white control issues with like Sunfalls. But outside of that, yeah, sweepers are a problem. And it's going to be in a deck that's very much swarm-based. But the beauty of a swarm-based deck is that Pixie struggles because they're trying to outgrind you, and you're going, no, every card in here is a 2-for-1. You're going to have to grind through nothing but 2-for-1s all the way through, or with Overlord, maybe a 3-for-1. And bouncing gets a lot worse when you have Paw Patch Recruits sitting around going, okay, so that's gone. Okay, well, then these threats are now bigger. And you just keep on going and put them in these catch-22 positions. So in a world of Esper Pixie, I like Cage. I really like pushing it that way.
Yeah, I think this adds to the rock, paper, scissors dynamic we're seeing in the meta right now. This is going to ask for people to play more sweepers, which is also something that's not happening a whole lot, similar to how Graveyard Play wasn't happening in prior weeks. So, and can I just say, I love the return of Virtue of Loyalty. I think that card really, really, really provides some, heavy inevitability when it comes to the grind. I love that card and where it's positioned, especially in this deck. So I've been playing with Selesnya Cage this past week, as some of y'all may know, have seen my streams, and I'm in love with the deck. I like where it's at in the meta.
Fair. And it's spicy. And I'll be honest, Max, I've got 3 RCQs at one store happening this weekend, and I have the cards supposed to come in. Despite all this weather, I'm sure by the time you're watching this, you know how the weather's resolved. But right now there is everything snowing. right? So I'm like praying
Yeah.
the cards get here in time. So here's hoping, chat, because I would really like to get to these RCQs with Cage and not have to fall back to something else.
I'd like to try the deck personally myself. I've said that I'm buying Outlaws of Thunder Junction just to get those Sandstorm Salvagers. But yeah, but there you have it. 2 more spicy brews for your ladder play. We hope you take advantage of these and let us know in the comments how you did if you pick these decks up and happen to play with them. Really, I just want to say, don't forget, check out the G Funky episode of the Rebelcast that we just shot and released both on Spotify and YouTube. We got to sit down with them, discuss the first Rebellion team event at Spotlight Atlanta. So if you want to hear about some of the highlights, some of the behind the scenes during that event and play testing, then go check out that episode.
Last but not least, please like, share, comment on this video to show support for your community. We appreciate having all of you here, and until next time, untap, upkeep, resist.